Let's talk about how the LDS tradition has a complicated relationship to Columbus. Today is Indigenous Peoples Day, formerly known as Columbus Day. Now, recently Americans have discovered, to play on a term on this topic, the complicated legacies that Columbus left behind, including all the horrible things he did in his life. And while this has fallen along traditional partisan divides of woke erasure of history, for many Americans, this has caused a reckoning of wrestling with the complicated history and the atrocities that Columbus inflicted on the indigenous peoples in the nation, which is why the holiday has rightly been changed from Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. But this topic has an especially complicated legacy within the LDS tradition. Wrestling with the sacralization of Columbus and his voyage and the Doctrine of Discovery opens up lots of other questions and issues. Indeed, confronting the concepts at the heart of the Columbus story brings into question fundamental ideas about scripture, prophetic fallibility, and indeed white supremacy. This video, I hope captures this much longer story, introducing the problems in the scriptural text connected to it, surveying the long interpretive traditions within the LDS faith, as well as bringing up some critiques and the voices we should be listening to on this matter. First, it's important to remember that it was far from determined that the United States would come to revere Columbus. He was Spanish, not British, and he actually never set foot on land that would eventually become part of the United States. Rather, in the 1780s and the 1790s, when the United States was searching for a usable past that was notably not British, they again discovered Columbus, saying that, well, maybe Columbus is someone we can find this founder outside of the Anglo tradition that we are now separating ourselves from. There is another ideological justification, however, for how Columbus became so central to American identity. And that was not despite his genocidal history, but because of it. The doctrine of discovery, this idea that God grants these powerful civilizations to conquer land that they discover and disinherit and marginalize and kill those indigenous peoples who had previously inhabited those lands. That was an agenda that Columbus was known for all the way back then, and Americans were now utilizing to their own advantage. Remember, those very same decades where Columbus becomes revered as an American folk hero due to his discovery of North America were the same decades that Americans were believing in manifest destiny and moving westward and taking that land from the indigenous and causing a racial genocide among many indigenous populations. So revering Columbus in early America was not just finding a new founder who did not pledge allegiance to the British king. It was meant to justify the present disinheriting of indigenous tribes, the vanishing Indian myths that had become so central to white American visions. That means that Joseph Smith was raised in a culture, in a community, that sacralized Columbus and his narrative as a way to both create a usable past as well as a colonizing present. And that principle of patriotism seeped into the American milieu and is also found in Joseph Smith's own scriptural texts. By the way, if you enjoy this type of nerdy context where we geek out about the past and how we are still wrestling with those legacies in the present, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Like and share the videos that you find useful. And if you want to give back, you can become a member to this channel, which grants you early access to the videos and a few other perks. History is a topic that I feel passionately about, and I've been thrilled to see so many other people also feel passionate about it, and we are developing a fun community on this channel. All right, let's get back to the history. That context of revering Columbus as a form of American patriotism saturated the world in which Joseph Smith was born and raised, and those principles seep into Joseph Smith's own teachings and indeed scripture. Most notoriously, in the Book of Mormon itself, there's a passage that from the very beginning, most Latter-day Saints interpreted as referring to and prophesying of Columbus. This is from 1 Nephi chapter 13, verse 12. You can see the full text here. Part of Nephi's vision. And I looked and beheld a man among the Gentiles, who was separated from the seed of my brethren by the many waters. And I beheld the Spirit of God, that it came down and wrought upon the man, and he went forth upon the many waters, even unto the seed of my brethren, who were in the promised land. Now, obviously, that verse is a bit vague. Most scriptural passages are, because then they can be appropriated for different matters. But from the earliest generations, Latter-day Saints interpret that scripture as referring to Columbus. We see that in sermons, we see that in textual commentaries, we see that in the church's official discourse. But there are some problems with that, because by adopting this doctrine of discovery that God led Columbus, it is then used to justify everything that Columbus did later, as well as what people have done in the name of Columbus and in the name of just the doctrine of discovery ever since. However, at least early on, Latter-day Saints interpret that passage in a variety of different ways for different meanings. Let me give you a couple examples from Brigham Young and Orson Hyde, who spoke at a July 4th celebration in 1854 in territorial Utah. This is Brigham Young. The Almighty moved upon Columbus to launch forth upon the trackless deep to discover the American continent. Again, emphasizing this doctrine of discovery, of God being the one to lead Columbus. But it wasn't just God leading him through inspiration. Orson Hyde, an apostle at the time, gave even more explicit instructions. Quote, Moroni presides over the destinies of America and feels a lively interest in all our doings. This same angel was with Columbus and gave him deep impressions by dreams and by visions respecting the New World. So on the one hand, this fits into the broader LDS narrative and discourse of God sponsoring chosen elites to come to the New World and mix with the remnants of the Book of Mormon. But in these Latter-day Saint leaders' hands, they then take it a step further, justifying that colonization was therefore sacralized as a result. That just like God inspired Columbus to come to the New World, disinherit the Native American, and take that land, so too, people today are led by the Spirit of God in similar colonization schemes. So in other words, as the Mormons are in territorial Utah, they are using the image and legacy of Columbus to justify their own colonization schemes, and no longer seeing Native Americans as human inheritors of that land with the right to citizenship and all the obligations that come with it, but instead God's chosen people having dominion. Now, eventually, that interpretive tradition evolves once again, no longer being emphasized to justify colonization, but instead to emphasize that Columbus's voyage was justified because it set in motion a context that would eventually allow the restoration to take place. This is the LDS apostle Mark E. Peterson, who said, quote, the true gospel could not be given to Israel of today unless it was restored, and the restoration could only come under favorable conditions in a free country where men could worship God according to the dictates of their own conscience. He says this in a broader address in which he said God inspired Columbus to lead European colonists to the New World in order to eventually create new forms of government like the United States, even though, of course, Columbus would not like the idea of him being the founder of a British colonial system rather than the Spanish. But that, in other words, this entire doctrine of discovery, this doctrine of manifest destiny, was once again sacralized. It was necessary because it allowed the restoration of the gospel. And to give you two books that take this to an even further extent, the popular BYU religion professor Arnold Garr published this book, Christopher Columbus, A Latter-day Saint Perspective. And then Clark Hinckley, a general authority and son of Gordon B. Hinckley, published this book with Deseret Book, Christopher Columbus, A Man Among the Gentiles. I'll also note that both of these books push back on the scholarly consensus on Columbus and his legacies, fitting into this broader partisan divide of we can't trust these woke professors who are trying to erase our history. So you see these narratives tinged with a partisan accent. But the overall lesson that we should take from these LDS interpretive traditions is that in sacralizing Columbus's voyage, saying that he was inspired of God, indeed being a man of God, that then gives justification for the atrocities that followed in Spanish colonialism and then in American colonialism, who are trying to act like Columbus themselves. Fortunately, there has been some pushback on this interpretation in recent years. I hope it's obvious what dangers come from this hermeneutic of sacralizing Columbus and his story and giving a divine sanction on the doctrine of discovery and manifest destiny. Reverencing his life and mission and seeing him as inspired means downplaying human genocide and native displacement. The doctrine of discovery led directly to massive loss, death, and displacement, and it provides the validation for a white supremacist theology in which God inspires this Anglo-American colonization. Now, there have been many who have tried to offer a different interpretation of Columbus and his scheme. But there are problems that arise because this interpretation is connected both to scripture and prophetic pronouncements. It means that by saying the doctrine of discovery is wrong, it's also raising the issue of scriptural fallibility and prophet fallibility. In other words, it would mean acknowledging some elements of the Book of Mormon are based in human culture rather than divine sanction, and that prophets could, for a lack of better words, be wrong. Now, some have offered what I think is a very interesting scholarly take. Zachary Hutchins, an English professor at Colorado State University, wrote this article, I Lead the Way Like Columbus, Joseph Smith Genocide and the Revelatory Ambiguity, in a wonderful volume published by Oxford University Press titled Americanist Approaches to the Book of Mormon, in which he says that wrestling with that scripture can prompt Latter-day Saints to come to a more nuanced and sophisticated take on race, prophetic authority, and scriptural fallibility. Others have posited that maybe that first Nephi passage is not referring to Columbus. Maybe it's referring to Bartolome de las Casas. But again, that's an interpretation that's pushing against the stream. But I think the most important voices to listen to when analyzing the legacies of this doctrinal sacralization of the doctrine of discovery come from Indigenous voices themselves. So if you're going to read one thing after this video, I hope it's this. The 54th volume of Dialogue of Journal of Mormon Thought, published in July of 2021, featured an entire roundtable. In fact, the entire issue, here's the gorgeous cover from that issue of Dialogue. The entire issue platforms Indigenous voices within the Mormon tradition, and I would say is one of the most important compilations of LDS writings and opinions in the most recent few decades. But it has an entire roundtable on Indigenous Mormon voices interpreting and critiquing this racist Columbus legacy, focusing on the theological interpretations and legacies and consequences that come from the sacralization of the doctrine of discovery, showing that it does real harm to the community and individuals when we embed those types of ideas within a scriptural and prophetic tradition. So in conclusion, I really doubt that the Latter-day Saint tradition is going to be able to do a full-throated wrestling with this Columbus narrative and all the consequences that come from it, because it's connected to these much broader questions and issues. It means wrestling with the consequences of scriptural humanity and prophetic fallibility. You can't tackle the Columbus myth within the Latter-day Saints without discussing the elephant in the room of whether scriptures and prophets could be wrong. But I think it's an important thing for the Latter-day Saint community to wrestle with, because it not just are those questions important in their own right, but it also means listening to voices that have long been marginalized within the Latter-day Saint, within religious, within American context. And that's those Indigenous voices who have been denouncing the doctrine of discovery all the way back to the 1490s. I hope this video made sense. If you have any critiques or think that I missed anything, please leave those in the comments. Like and share the video if you found it useful. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. If you like these historical academic deep dives on American religious and Mormon history. History has never been more relevant than it is today. These discussions, more than just animating the academic halls of ivory towers, have real implications for people in the pews, on the streets, in their homes today, which is why these discussions need to happen.